You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. You may find all your sales and rental equipment needs at McAllister.com. We are pleased to announce our podcast is now a member of the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle or me at leadersandlegends.net. Our guests today are Chris Lafave. He's the curator of the Kurt Vonnegut Museum and Library. And our other guest is Kip Tew. This is his third appearance on the Leaders and Legends podcast. He is on the board of the Kurt Vonnegut Museum and Library. And thank you, Kip, for putting this together. It was something we talked about for quite a while, and I'm excited to talk to you both. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us.
I feel intimidated. Kip is an actual leader and legend, so
Times three.
Yeah, times three.
We need to do a Kip Tew podcast, just turn it into a roast.
Yeah. Let's go on. Let's talk about Kurt Vonnegut.
Think we could find anyone to appear?
Yeah, I'm afraid you'd find more than one.
Yeah, I knew you were going to dodge the subject, but that was immediate. Let's drop this right now.
Let's start with you, Chris. Let's start with the basics. How did you find out about Kurt Vonnegut, and what was the first of his books that you read?
I was an undergraduate at Ball State University in Muncie, which is the Harvard of Muncie. And I was playing bass in a rock band. So, I was really big into reading when I was younger, and you don't read for pleasure as much when you're in college. At least I didn't. But we had this saintly gentleman who was living in our house, was the only one not in the band. And he would very kindly not complain when we'd plug in at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday and just blow his ears out. So I trusted his judgment. So he loaned me Breakfast of Champions. And I remember taking that home and thinking, this is a very, very wild experience to read this book when you turn to page 5 and you see the drawing of the asterisk, and I can change that to the proper term if I need to. But it was pretty wild to see a book like that written by a 50-year-old who seemed comfortable calling out the nonsense that I saw in society. And so that definitely turned me on to it. And then a couple years later, I'm living in Chicago as the economy is just collapsing.
And early 2000s or?
Oh, yeah, early 2007 or late 2007. And I just remember right around the time I officially didn't have money to leave the house, I just had a library card, and I rented Cat's Cradle from the library, and I can't even begin to exaggerate this, that it was this funny book about subject matters that aren't funny at all. And there was nothing funny about 7 guys living in an apartment. I think 3 of us were employed full-time, and the other 4 were like cobbling together. I was playing in a bluegrass band, and that was honestly one of the more economically rewarding situations. About $100 a month and free mac and cheese was one of my major capitalistic accomplishments at the time. And I remember reading Cat's Cradle, which is a funny book about religion, weaponry, and the end of the world, and how like it's kind of somebody's fault, it's kind of not somebody's fault. There was just something really beautiful and funny about that. So that made me a Vonnegut fanatic. I wanted to read everything he ever wrote. I found myself in Indianapolis a couple of years later due to some family health problems from my father. I was doing my master's in library science at IUPUI, and one night at Nikki Blaine's, we're all sitting around complaining about our lot in life, and And I said, yeah, I'll probably move on to another city unless Indianapolis comes up with some kind of Vonnegut library. It was maybe a month or two later when I got an email from a friend saying, hi, you have to eat your words. You're going to live in Indianapolis for the rest of your life. It's like, you got to be kidding me. It's like, sure enough, I ran down there, and that was when I met Julia Whitehead. And I said, you can have all my free time if that's going to help you build this to the kind of living legend tribute to Vonnegut that we would like to have and that we should have here in Indianapolis.
Kip?
I think I first read Vonnegut in high school.
North Central, right? You went
North Central High School, and my brother was a bigger Kurt Vonnegut fan than I was. My younger brother, he talked about him constantly. And Julia's ex-husband at the time was very close friends with my brother. I had just come off the presidential campaign of Barack Obama, who won in 2008, and she approached me and said, she mistakenly thought I was somebody in the community. She said, I need somebody like you to help me get this thing off the ground. And so it was her idea. She had built a relationship with some of Vonnegut's relatives, which is an incredibly important part of bringing the library to fruition. And because others had started and tried to think about it, but she is a bulldog, unlike anybody I've ever met, and it's the reason this place exists because of her determination. And we just help raise money, help get people interested, help interact with the community at large here to try to get this thing going. And so, that's why I'm here.
What draws you to Vonnegut's writings?
Well, first it's the humor, of course. I mean, he's one of the funniest guys that ever put pen to paper. That his ability, I think, to look at the absurdity of life and make it both poignant and funny at the same time. You can cry on one page and laugh on the next page. And he does it in a way that is very approachable. It is not, it's not one paragraph goes on for 12 pages. I mean, he knows how to turn a phrase that makes it easy to read.
Kurt Vonnegut attended Shortridge High School, which clearly has produced some amazing Hoosiers, Richard Lugar being one of them, and there are several others. What is it about his experience in growing up in Indianapolis that you think fueled his writing? Had kind of an interesting background. His family was wealthy, then they weren't wealthy. His dad was the architect for the Athenaeum. Is that correct?
His grandfather was.
Yeah. Forgive me. Mm-hmm. So tell me about that upbringing.
His father was an architect as well. His mother was a socialite. They very powerful family. His father was one of the board members of the Children's Museum here in Indianapolis. He designed the mascot, the original mascot, Sydney the Seahorse, which is quite a bit smaller than the life-size T-Rex, but really neat, really neat looking thing nonetheless. And I think he wrote about this in Architectural Digest. It's one of the really random and super cool things that we found in an article from, I think, 1984, where he was talking about his father being this creative sort. And he was really, really inspired and interested in that. And he would take his friends home, and they were used to their fathers wearing suits and being businessmen. And they'd see his father just kind of playing with, paints and what have you. And it was drawing buildings. It was just a different thing for them to look at. And Kurt was very inspired by that. Kurt's sister was a sculptor. She worked really well with her hands. She never really did anything with it career-wise, which Kurt used to give her grief about. Mm-hmm. But she said, just because you're good at something doesn't mean you have to do it, which, floored Kurt Vonnegut, because he said, that's not how I perceived it. So, I mean, creativity was part of his family tradition. Now, the Great Depression occurred, and his father said, don't you dare go into the arts and humanities. And that was where I think a bit of a split occurred. And they said, go to Cornell and study the sciences. And, that was where he kind of went off to a scenario where he went to 5 universities and received 0 degrees for the vast majority of his life.
His family, though, also was well known in town because part of the family owned a hardware store downtown Indianapolis.
Wasn't there a brewery that was part of the family as well that got lit by Prohibition?
Yeah, Kurt's mother's family. Albert Lieber was her father, and they were responsible for Indianapolis Brewing Company. Kurt's great-grandfather, Clemens Vonnegut, was the one who founded Vonnegut Hardware Store. It's kind of neat. Some of the buildings that house the hardware store are still around. The Ace Hardware across from the Melody Inn is an old Vonnegut hardware store. Audrey's Antique Shop over on the east side of Indy on 10th Street. And actually the White Rabbit Cabaret down Fountain Square is an old Vonnegut hardware store.
But his family came here from Germany, is that correct?
Yep, Munster, Germany. Clemens Vonnegut would have arrived here, we believe, in 1850 and started the hardware company. The original building was in downtown Indy, not far away from the Circle, on Washington Street, and that was the immigration story of the Vonneguts.
How did his heritage, his German heritage, come into play as he started to grow up? He was born in 1922, so that's 4 years after the end of the Great War. We'll discuss his service in Germany during World War II here in a minute. But, families back then, generations prior to Kurt's, had some real dilemmas because they loved their country, the United States, but they were proud of their German heritage. And when that conflicted in the Great War, a lot of them had choices to make. And what choice did the Vonnegut family make?
It was complicated. Is the best way that I can answer that. I mean, because everything's complicated. His family was put in a real bind. We're going to do an exhibit about this in October, actually, as part of a German heritage exhibit. Because Kurt really wrote a decent amount about the fact that in World War I, all of the anti-German sentiment that was going on in Indianapolis had a profound effect on his family. They stopped speaking German as a primary language in the home. The Athenaeum was known as Das Deutschhaus. The name was changed to the Athenaeum. Yes, so it was changed to the Athenaeum during that time frame, as opposed to Das Deutschhaus. And Kurt wrote in Palm Sunday, "My parents voluntarily made me ignorant as proof of their patriotism." Now, I don't know if that's an overblown remark. His family wasn't very nationalistic either. You'll notice a tremendous anti-nationalism in Vonnegut's work, deeply rooted in, I think, the influence of his father. Like in that same Architectural Digest article I was telling you about, there's a line in there where he says the concept of boundaries of nations being a matter of great importance would have completely flabbergasted my father. So I think that may have been a little bit of a part of his upbringing as well. He does make that remark. He gave a speech at the Athenaeum in 1996 where he said, "Everything I love about Germany came from many Germanys, and everything I loathe about Germany came from one." Now he's talking about the Holocaust at that particular juncture.
Well, when his grandparents and previous generations were living in Germany, there were hundreds of principalities and free cities and duchies and kingdoms and stuff like that. So Germany then in the early 19th century was clearly much different than what he would have seen as a kid, just in terms of after the unification in the 1870s.
Yeah, absolutely. Clemens Vonnegut left Germany in large part because, in the late 1840s, there was a revolution going on, and it was very pro-organized religion in nature, and Vonnegut was a questioner. He preferred the term freethinker. By the time Kurt came around, he liked the term humanist. So, Kurt Vonnegut, in large part, Kurt Vonnegut's great-grandfather, in a large part, came to the United States for religious freedom, and in this case, the religious freedom not to practice one.
Kip, is there any part of Kurt's story as a young man that is familiar to you in the sense that you didn't grow up really that far from Shortridge? I know you went to North Central, but is there any part of it that resonates with you? The questioning, sort of like it seems that Vonnegut was someone who, I don't know if he had a happy childhood. What would you say? It seems like there were parts of it and then it just kind of turned bitter.
Yeah, I'll answer your first question, which is, I think Slaughterhouse-Five, the message of the book, if you want to call it a message, obviously it was a thinly veiled autobiography of his time in Dresden in World War II. But I think that leaves everybody with about the same kind of feeling that I had from that book, which is, humans are horrible to each other, and we go to war with each other for ridiculous reasons, largely, and narcissistic tendencies. If we don't tame the savages of man, we end up with atrocity. And that book, believe it or not, with that heavy of a subject, makes it funny, which I think is, an incredibly important gift to the world, that people can do that, so that it can be digested and still digested in a way that makes you think, but also touches the other parts of your humanity. And so for me, when I first read that book, it had that effect on me. I don't know that it's because he's from Indianapolis that I felt even more kinship towards it. But, his language, how he wrote, was Indianapolis. He says, everything he is Indianapolis. And so being a resident of this city all the years that I've been, I'd like to think some of that is that. But, our culture has changed quite a bit since the 60s here as well.
Vonnegut graduated from Shortridge in 1940, went to Cornell University. You mentioned that earlier. His dad was like, go do something, son. But on December 7th, 1941, fate and the Japanese intervened. Vonnegut ended up serving in the United States military and being present at the Battle of the Bulge. Started on December 16th, 1944. It's kind of a bit of bad luck, per se, that he ended up in the Ardennes forest in December 44. Tell us how. I would
say it was bad luck for most people that ended up in the Ardennes forest, right?
I think there were some grunts who kind of expected to be there, and there are other people who didn't, just because of the demands of the D-Day invasion and the manpower demands that were important to that act. A lot of people who thought they maybe were going to have a different career in the military ended up carrying that M1. How did he end up in the European theater and at the Battle of the Bulge? And then what happened to him at the battle?
It's so strange that this is such a weird and long and complicated story, because it was in his junior year at Cornell, bombing most of his classes because he spent all of his time with the Cornell Daily Sun, writing for the newspaper, and a lot of time with his fraternity Delta Upsilon as well. He called it a beer-soaked time. He spent the summer of his freshman year at Butler studying journalism. The professor said, you write at a sophomoric level, and Kurt said, that's good, I'm only a freshman. Kurt and Jane, this brilliant woman that he met in elementary school, and they, kind of reformed a relationship in late high school and after college. They were kind of on again, off again in his junior year. And so after a bout with pneumonia, that's when he joined the Army. And the Army, believe it or not, sent him to Carnegie and the University of Tennessee for heavy artillery training. So he was trained to drive this gun around, the howitzer. Made a big bang when it shot off. And he was in school until spring of 44, and then the unit, the 106th Division, was shipped off to the Battle of the Bulge. So it's already towards the end of the war. He's lightly armed, lightly dressed. He's being used as a scout, so most of the actual shooting training he got from his father. He said, thank God my father was a gun nut. But he said he was captured nearly immediately. Kurt claimed to have never killed anybody in World War II. He said bayonets aren't very good against tanks. He also had an uncle, his uncle-in-law, that he couldn't stand. And when he came back from the war, the uncle said, you're a real man now. You've been to war. And Kurt said, I wanted to kill him. He would have been the only German I ever killed. I wanted to pause and thank you for laughing, because that joke doesn't always land. So Kurt was marched about 60 miles to a train that took him to Dresden. And this is where the story gets really strange, because, not only does he survive the Battle of the Bulge, which was complete chaos, and his unit was considered, largely, it's the gambit in chess when you sacrifice a player. So, right. So they weren't expected to survive. He marches 60 miles through the snow of northern Belgium in the Ardennes forest, which, they don't have proper footwear. That's a hellish hellish experience. They get put on a boxcar where they're, smashed into other human beings, and then they're there for quite a while, and they survive a Christmas Eve bombing. Long story short, he gets to Dresden, and during the day they made prenatal syrup in a factory, sneak little spoonfuls of it under penalty of death for stealing. But the nutrients in it probably helped keep them alive, and that's where they were on the 13th of February, 1945, when British and American airplanes bombed Dresden for about 24 hours and killed thousands of people. So that's the really tough part of Slaughterhouse-Five, where you get into the reading of the aftermath of the bombing, and you've got German civilians throwing things at them, and you've got, the inability to really clean up the city because there's so much destruction, and they're trying to put bodies on top of one another and light them on fire. When I'm giving tours every day, I'm sitting there just deciding, how graphic into the story do I go? Because it's a really challenging piece of history, and the more you read Slaughterhouse-Five, the more the metafiction starts to fall away, and it's just a flat-out work of nonfiction to me at this juncture. Now, this is what happens when you read the book 100 times or more. But it's really galling and haunting, and it's shocking that he survived it. And he wrote a letter home to his family in May of 45, where he says, this is what happened. Everybody was killed, but not me. They bombed Dresden. Everybody was killed, but not me. Mm-hmm. He's already got a form of "So It Goes" written into his letter home to his family, informing them that he's alive. It would take him another 22, 23 years to finish Slaughterhouse-Five.
Do you get the sense that Kurt Vonnegut felt sorry for the people of Germany who were enduring these bombings, you could say through no fault of their own, and then that's an argument.
Certainly Dresden.
Yeah.
When you read, I'm sorry, I'm just going to give my opinion here for a second.
Oh, go ahead.
When you read Slaughterhouse-Five, you get I've gotten the distinct impression that he wasn't blaming the average citizen in the town of Dresden for their fate. Mm-hmm. In fact, he's fairly critical of the Allied forces for doing what they did in Dresden, which, history, I think, can reflect upon it and say it wasn't necessary. The war was pretty much over, but we went ahead and bombed the shit out of Dresden and killed. There's all kinds of estimates as to how many people died, but almost everybody in that city died. It was pretty close to Hiroshima or Nagasaki on the level of destruction of that city. And the question is, was it necessary to eliminate all those fellow human beings that late in the war?
Yeah, and Vonnegut said, outwardly that Dresden shouldn't have been bombed. I think he felt a great deal of sorrow for the human race in general. It's a recurring theme in his general work. There's a theme in a scene in Cat's Cradle where he talks about God spoke to man, man stood up as made of mud and said, "What is the purpose of all of this?" And God says, "Everything must have a purpose." And man says, "Yep." And God says, "Well, I leave it to you to think of one for all of this." And then he walks away. That's a very powerful scene. And Vonnegut, I don't really think he was a cynic or an overly depressed or angry person. I think he was someone who looked at the world and saw a lot of confusion and pain and suffering. And I think he really, on some level, believed in okay, we got to hope for chocolate chip cookies or, a sunny day. And that's why he kept repeating that line from his Uncle Alex from Indianapolis, who would ever say, notice when you're happy. Notice when you're happy. Say, if this isn't nice, what is? And just that was a recurring theme in his work, because he'd seen some real horrors, and he needed Slaughterhouse-Five. He needed the Tralfamadorians and the planet Tralfamador, where the aliens are shaped like toilet plungers and the air is made of cyanide. He needed that to tell this garish, horrible story. And then even to later days in his life, if you asked him in person how he felt about Dresden, he would color it up. He would say, "Oh, it was a great adventure. I wouldn't miss it for the world." But then, 20 years later, you go and read Bluebeard, and he talks much more linearly and directly about what it was like, especially in the aftermath of the German guards abandoning them and just watching the whole country is just destroyed, and there's people walking around trying to figure out what the hell they're going to do next, especially people who were going to be executed by the Soviets not very soon afterwards.
Especially the women who knew what was coming.
Yeah.
You're listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guests are Chris Lafave, curator of the Kurt Vonnegut Museum and Library, located right here in Indianapolis on Indiana Avenue. I get that right? Indiana Avenue, right? Mm-hmm. Our other guest is Kip Tew, multiple guest now on the Leaders and Legends podcast. We can't simply get enough, Chris, just in case you wanted to know.
Yeah.
Cannot get enough.
The leader and legend Kip Tew.
One thing that I didn't know in doing the research for this was that Kurt must have gotten, or Mr. Vonnegut must have gotten some of his sense of humor or something in the water at Shortridge High School, because he went to school with, I think it was Madeline Pugh, who was one of the writers for the I Love Lucy show, and others. One of the most brilliant comedy writers of all time. Did Vonnegut, do you think?
That part of town, because David Letterman grew up in that part of town too. So
Ted Boehm.
One of the great humorists of modern day. No offense, Ted.
Kip, you want to say that again real loud?
I love Ted Boehm. Don't get me wrong. And he does have a very good dry sense of humor, but I don't put him on the same pedestal as David Letterman. So,
yeah, but Boehm graduated from college and law school, and poor Kurt couldn't seem to figure it out.
I don't think Letterman graduated, did he?
No, he didn't.
We're doing this wrong, guys.
No, I think he. I'm sure. I would hope Ball State's given him an honorary degree by now. Oh my God!
Do you get the sense that his humor was his Prozac? Kurt Vonnegut's, I mean, like certain people look for ways to cope with life, and sometimes it's alcohol, sometimes it's something else, and sometimes it's a little more intrinsic sense of humor. Do you believe?
Well, again, there's a real dichotomy between what people admit to and what they, So Vonnegut said, my sense of humor was developed in two ways. One, from being the youngest by far. And if the youngest kid around the table, when the one older kid is 5 years older than you and the other kid is 9 years older than you, you better be funny if you wanted any attention around the dinner table with grown-ups. And then the secondary thing had to do with working for the Shortridge Daily Echo, where he did work with Madeline Pugh. And you found out pretty quickly from your peers if your joke didn't go over well. So he learned, and it's interesting because his style is very opposite of mine. Vonnegut called himself a basher who would sweat over every sentence until it was perfect. I can't fathom doing that. I think in undergrad I turned in assignments without ever reading them. So
reading the assignments or reading what you wrote?
Reading what I wrote, or reading the assignments for that matter. Yeah, I mean it was tough to get all that done. So I mean. I think that was what made Vonnegut really interesting, was he was such an unbelievable craftsman and someone who cared so much about the reader. Whereas, I've grown up liking avant-garde jazz and jam bands, and to a certain degree, like improvisation could be downright disrespectful towards the audience. So it's like, it's comical that he was such a pro audience artist.
I want to jump in here too, because I think you're onto something. I do believe that the humor was sort of his Prozac, but it also harkens to something we have to mention here, and it's one of the missions of our library and museum. So I want to plug that a little bit, and that is, he had undiagnosed post-traumatic stress syndrome. I don't see how it's possible for him not to have had it. He saw incredible horrors. His mother committed suicide. His sister died in a car crash. I mean, he had, just these incredibly traumatic series of events in his life, almost all of them when he was, at a very impressionable age. And so he dealt with it. It was before there was Prozac, before there were antidepressants, before there was, a widespread acceptance of going to see a psychiatrist or getting counseling or therapy and those types of things. And so he dealt with it by writing and using humor in his writing. But so I think you're dead on with that thought.
I'll go a step further, and I think writing was his Prozac. When he got to 1990, when he was working on his novel Timequake, he was struggling pretty heavily with the novel, and he said on multiple occasions, "This is my last novel, this is my last book." But when he died in 2007, he was working on a novel. So I think, it was very hard to turn that off. So, I mean, he was working out some challenges that he had. In the novel Slapstick, he talks very openly about it. Coming back to Indianapolis for the funeral of his Uncle Alex. He's talking about how weird it is to come back to your hometown and see your family that used to number, counting cousins and uncles and stuff like that, used to be massive. and now is not, because people have either spread out throughout the world or they've died and gone on. He wrote this amazing book about loneliness, and it had to do with the death of his sister who passed away from cancer in 1958, and he adopted her children. And he used the scheme of Alcoholics Anonymous to kind of sum up the whole idea. He was like, Alcoholics Anonymous is great because it gives everybody a gazillion random family members who have shared trauma and who can help each other get through life. And so he based this hilarious scheme where like everybody in the world ends up inheriting 100,000 random family members based on strange middle names like Daffodil and Raspberry. And
So did I screw up? Say she died in a car wreck? That's the Slaughterhouse-Five version of how she died.
No, that's his sister. That's Kurt's sister died in a car accident.
But his mom killed herself.
You said
like right
somebody died
around
of
Mother's
cancer.
Day, isn't it?
Okay,
44?
so Kurt's sister died of cancer in 1958. Kurt's mother died of an alcohol and sleeping pill related overdose. There's some family debate as to whether it was intentional or not. Vonnegut believed that she took her own life. So I mean,
And the other sister died in a car wreck. You said one died of cancer.
Yeah.
And one died.
No
of car wreck.
one died in a car. Kurt's brother-in-law died in a train crash. A train went off a drawbridge. A lot of okay. So a lot.
So we're not taking the Vonneguts to Vegas with us.
Probably not. No. So I mean, I think he did live through more than the average human being, in terms of major trauma. And humor was a big part of coping with it. Writing was a big part of coping with it, and the visual arts that he got. I mean, he was into it throughout his life. He was a doodler all the time. But when he got into screen printing with Joe Petro in the early 90s, I mean, he credited that with having saved his life.
So he basically didn't follow his dad's advice in his chosen profession.
He tried.
Yeah, Lord knows he tried. He studied anthropology at the University of Chicago, and he called it poetry masquerading as science, and that's how I got away with studying it. So I mean, he sure tried, and I think on some level he thought it was interesting that he never got to be an architect.
Well, and he worked for a Volvo dealership, right? Was it
Saab?
I'm sorry, Saab. Yeah, I shoot him. He worked for a Saab dealership. He worked at Kodak. Is that right? He worked in corporate America in a couple of different jobs and absolutely hated it. I can't remember. Well, he was in Syracuse or near Syracuse, and he was upstate New York somewhere. Schenectady.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, Schenectady. He worked for General Electric. But I think there was...
I am not the historian. Clearly.
That's okay.
No, and the more I talk, the more I realize what a nerd I am. Like how like after 11 years of this, my head is so filled with... information about it. But yeah.
So how did he decide this is what I want to do for a living, and then have the perseverance to stay with it? I mean, it's like you read about bands, right? Where they made $50 a night for 5 years, then all of a sudden they had a hit. Is that kind of what happened to him metaphorically?
Yeah, I mean, Jane helped him with it. I think she truly believed in his talent as a writer. I think the fact that you could probably see that he sweated over every sentence, and that he took his craft very seriously probably helped. I think she knew that having come home from the bombing of Dresden, that Kurt had a story to tell that would be absolutely in the human interest. My guess is he already had a unique sense of humor that would seem to step outside of the typical, and so that probably helped as well. So she was a major cheerleader for him. And then one of my favorite stories of all time, especially because we have students come in here. So in 1950, he's working for GE, and he's got 2 kids, and he doesn't care for the corporate America job very much. So he wrote a short story entitled "Report on the Barnhouse Effect," and he got a rejection letter back from Collier's magazine. At the bottom of this rejection letter, it says in pencil, "This is a little sententious for us." Now, like most people, none of us knew what the hell that meant, but we looked it up in Google, and it means smart alecky. So it's sententious to use the word sententious. And he says, you're not the Kurt Vonnegut who worked on the Cornell Sun, are you? And it's this guy Knox Berger who knew him at Cornell. And so I always tell these kids, don't burn your bridges, because it's like, I grew up with helicopter parents, and I love my mom and dad to death, but it was like, go go to bed by 10 p.m., don't smoke cigarettes, and nothing bad will ever happen to you. And that's not really
Eat your vegetables.
Yes, but sometimes it's better to okay, you never know when someone will be able to do you a turn. So Nuxberger made Vonnegut write this story 5 times. But he eventually got paid $750 for it, which to me is still a lot of money. But in 1950 was a heck of a lot of money to everybody. And 4 stories later, gets paid $12.50. Quits his job with GE right away. Moved his family to Barnstable, Massachusetts, and Cape Cod, and that's where he lived from 1951 to 1970. He kept, that opened up enough doors that I think his career at the time was writer, even though he did buy a Saab dealership in 1956, 57, and ran it into the ground in about a year. And he
Who the hell drove a Saab in the 50s?
It was interesting.
Apparently nobody.
Yeah.
Well, he couldn't sell any
the
of them.
Swedes. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll tell you the joke when we're off the air, but it's pretty profane. So I mean, he just had a lot of tenacity and went through a lot of failure. That's the other thing I tell the students about is he just player piano, not a hit. Sirens of Titan, considered a masterpiece today. Not a hit when it came out.
Player piano's 52.
Yeah, player piano's 52. Sirens is 59.
But did Vonnegut have an innate sense or a reasonable sense of his own talent? Did he believe in himself? And that's, Kip, you've read a lot about him. Is that something that you go, well, he didn't make it. Not everyone hits a home run at their first at bat, so let's keep swinging because I've got the talent to make this work.
He had one thing that a lot of people lack, and he had a wife who was 100%, 1,000,000% saw his talent and made sure that he continued on. So many people feel like they have to provide for their family and do the usual world work of raising their family and making sure there's food on the table. And she's like, this is your talent, and I'm going to help you nurture your talent. And yeah, he had incredible tenacity himself, but I don't think it would have happened without Jane.
No way in hell does it happen without Jane. I don't think. I mean, he had. I think it's normal to have self-doubts, and especially when you have rejection letter after rejection letter after rejection letter, which is how anybody starts anything. God, I wish somebody would have told me that growing up, is that failure will be a part of your life, and you just got to swim through it to a certain degree.
But Slaughterhouse-Five, to go back to that, hey, why did he call it that? What was that purpose of that name, or genesis of the title of the book?
It was the name of the meat locker that they were held in as prisoners of war. That
he descended down into to avoid.
I mean, it was the name of the slaughterhouse that they were sleeping in every night, and there was a bomb shelter just outside that they were able to crawl into.
So that's published, I think, in 1969.
Yep.
Right in the middle of the Vietnam War. How did the Vietnam War propel the sales of that book and then Vonnegut's clear literary stardom? In your opinion, would Slaughterhouse-Five has been so successful or as successful if it was written in a time of peace?
I mean, hypothetical questions are always hard to answer, but yeah, I mean, the Vietnam War played an enormous role in that.
I would say not just the fact that it was not a time of peace, but it was the kind of war the Vietnam War was, and that there was so much protest against it, and there was so much consternation in this country. And his book, Slaughterhouse-Five, is sort of the personification of the futility of war in some ways. And so I think that fed into it. Without all that combined, it probably wouldn't have taken off. But the counterculture at the time, the people were protesting, ate it up.
Yeah.
But there was a sense that the parallel could have been the wanton destruction represented by Dresden coming so close towards the end of the war, with the wanton destruction of the villages and the farms or the rice paddies or whatever of Vietnam. But the American people have never felt, in anything that I've ever read, that World War II was anything other than a just war foisted upon the American people, whereas Vietnam is looked at, we intervened in an internal civil war with no clear sense of how to win. Did that matter to the people, that World War II was a just war and Vietnam was seen as a complete failure? And
the book doesn't really, I think, address the differences in the two wars, because it's a novel about what happened.
But the American
Billy
people
Pilgrim.
could watch the bombing and the destruction on their TV every night that was going on in Vietnam, and then pick up Slaughterhouse-Five and go, okay, now I get it.
Right.
Yeah, and that's where I think Vonnegut's voice comes in. Not only does he write a foreword and an afterword to Slaughterhouse-Five, where he kind of describes what he's doing. In the beginning of the book, he calls the book a failure twice in the first 20 pages of the book, which I think is just such a bold move. Because not a lot of authors do that. Because he says there's nothing intelligent to say about a massacre. These are the kind of sentences that you see in Slaughterhouse-Five that stop your heart. And then at the end, he's writing about Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King, and then his father, who he says, he left me his guns, they rust. He was a sweet old man. He died of natural causes. So it goes. And at the end, they talk about the amount of population there is in the world. And Bernard O'Hare says, I suppose they will all want dignity. And Vonnegut goes, I suppose.
Which means none of them went into politics, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's... I think... there's, the genius of that book was really loud at a time.
Is that your favorite Vonnegut book?
Not even close. No, that's...
What is yours?
Cat's Cradle, probably.
He is wearing a Cat's Cradle shirt,
yeah.
Chris, which you can see in the podcast photograph that's posted. What's your favorite Vonnegut book?
Mine is Slaughterhouse-Five, and I think Bluebeard would be second for me. Man Without a Country is probably third. All three of them just speak to me. Bluebeard, because I'm getting old, and that's a story about an old man and reflecting on his life and what was important.
Still a warrior on the bicycle, my friend.
I highly recommend Bluebeard for people my age. Definitely gives you a nice perspective. I say Slaughterhouse-Five, mostly because it was the first book of his I read, and it sort of changed everything for me. And so I look at it and just say, it's such a wonderful piece of fiction, piece of writing, and it opened the door to the rest of Vonnegut. So it's just my favorite because of that. And Cat's Cradle was the first book you read, right? Is that what you said?
It wasn't the first, but it was the most profound, I think. And I've talked about, we've had a lot of visitors come into the museum dealing with loss, and the book Cat's Cradle keeps coming up as like a sort of a coping mechanism for when something completely outside of your control happens. Now, Slaughterhouse-Five is the same in that regard. Like people reference that as well. But when people are dealing with things that are bigger than they are, and they can't stop whatever less than amazing thing is happening to them at this moment, books like Slaughterhouse-Five and Cat's Cradle get mentioned pretty heavily in that scenario.
Do you have Harry Chapin on Endless Loop here at the museum and library?
They did put it on the soundtrack for the radio station that plays throughout the Vonnegut library. They had a sense of humor.
Good for them.
I'm not sure that song is terribly connected to Vonnegut, but it was that tune that guys hear on the radio and go, "Oh no, oh God, I don't really want to cry in front of these people right now."
It's impactful song for sure. How did Slaughter? We'll move on to the later part of his life, including, of course, the brilliant cameo in Back to School with Rodney Dangerfield. How did Slaughterhouse-Five's success impact his life?
It's a PhD level question.
I mean, did it both give him financial security, but then raise the bar of expectation? Like, now you must write Slaughterhouse-Fives for the rest of your life?
I think he kind of went in the other direction in that sense. He explored postmodernism pretty heavily through Breakfast of Champions and slapstick. He's he's definitely a major character in the novel Breakfast of Champions. The critics were unkind to those books, which today people don't badmouth Breakfast of Champions. They might still badmouth slapstick because they're wrong. And Jailbird.
Or think it's the movie with Paul Newman.
No, not that one. But Jailbird was a huge critical success. So I mean, he had his ups and downs like any novelist, but he had some real big ones. Like Galapagos got him rave reviews. Man Without a Country turned him on to a younger generation when he was on the Jon Stewart show. So I mean, he lived a very full career, and I was new to that when I came on here. I had no idea how prolific that he had been. I didn't know that he wrote 14 novels and multiple collections of short stories, essays galore.
Well, I would add, though, back to sort of the question you said and how it launches career. I don't think there's any doubt that it did bring that level of stress to him, but he had it already. I mean, as Chris said earlier, he was a perfectionist in his writing, believe it or not, and very, very much a craftsman in his writing. So he wanted to make sure the next book was as good as the last book, which is all the sort of one of the cues of great, transforming artists throughout time is that they're adherence to that type of stuff. But also it changed him personally, changed his life personally. It hurt his relationship with his wife. It hurt for at least a while. It hurt his relationships with his children. He became a celebrity. And
countercultural celebrity.
And he adopted some of the bad characteristics of celebrity. I mean, I worship him. I'm an original member of this museum and those things, but he was not a perfect man by any stretch of the imagination. And he had, if you watch the Robert Weedy documentary, which I highly, highly recommend, it does a pretty fair job of going through a bunch of this stuff. And one of the things that celebrity and fame can do to you is it can cause you to change yourself a little bit and be seen as bigger than what you actually are. I mean, you went through a little bit of that, but I think he also came to terms with it later in life.
And didn't he? You said he was more of a. Would it be fair to classify Vonnegut as an agnostic?
Yeah.
And his wife embraced Christianity at a certain point.
Well, his wife embraced the concept of religion. She was a Quaker growing up. In the 1960s, she got into the teachings of the Maharishi. She campaigned for McGovern. She was just a very active person, and I think Vonnegut struggled with that. But yeah, I mean, their problems were vast. It's one of the more tragic parts of his story that I think.
He was born in 22, so he was a kindergartner basically when the Great Depression hit. Then he serves in World War II. He comes out. He has some. I mean, I don't know if you could say his failure to obtain a college degree was in and of itself a failure, but jobs he doesn't like. He's trying to get published. As he comes of age, Slaughterhouse-Five comes out in Vietnam. He understands the horror of combat, of what happens there. Was there a particular, two quick questions. One is, how much did the outside world and what was happening affect his writing or influence his writing? Not his mentality, but the world. How much did that influence it? And second, do you ever believe that, or can you pinpoint when he was happy? Like his uncle said.
God, pinpointing his happiness would be way more than I would want to speak to. I mean, I think
when he was hanging out with Morley Safer and what was the other author name from Baltimore?
Sidney Offutt. I think that was a happy time for him.
Or was it like one of our previous podcast guests, Donnie Walsh of the Pacers, described Coach Larry Brown as only happy when he's unhappy? Was Vonnegut only happy when he was unhappy?
No, I don't think that's true at all. I think he loved to socialize. He was pretty extroverted. And he loved music. He got a lot of enjoyment out of the arts and humanities. He got a lot of enjoyment out of other people. His son Mark describes him as a pessimistic optimist, which sounds like a contradiction in terms, but I don't think it really was. What was the first question again?
How did the world, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, in the prime of his writing years, the world was undergoing some significant changes and experiencing significant conflicts. Nothing like World War II, of course, but at the same time, was he a progressive who derided the Reagan years, or was he someone who was taken in? That's a biased way to ask the question. Was he someone who was sympathetic to like the nuclear freeze movement, that sort of stuff? Was he susceptible to that, and did it affect his writing?
I mean, I think most artists are. I mean, like if you look at Player Piano, he based it off of his time at GE. He was watching the future being created before his eyes, and he thought, oh my God, how are human beings ever going to be able to compete with technology and globalization and all this rapid economic and technological change? Back then, the critics and the fans didn't get the book necessarily, and they pigeonholed him as a science fiction author. Tried to publish it against Utopia 14, but today I think it's the book that Andrew Yang probably sleeps with under his pillow. So, and you've got The Sirens of Titan. I guess that one leaned more into science fiction, but, people read Cat's Cradle and they thought, oh, the Cuban Missile Crisis. And people read God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater. They thought, oh, the 1964 presidential election between Goldwater and LBJ, who, Kurt kind of used Roosevelt as a stand-in for some of the Great Society ideas. Jailbird, he was talking about Watergate and the aftermath of that. Dead-Eye Dick has to do with his feelings on guns, which he was pretty anti-gun. Galapagos had to do with environmental catastrophes. So, I mean, he was very prescient with what he was writing, and he was trying to use the outside world as an inspiration.
Kip?
I agree with everything he just said.
Just like when you and I were on TV together, right?
Well, no, yeah, that happened quite frequently.
We have a few minutes left with Chris Lafave, curator, the Kurt Vonnegut Museum and Library here in downtown Indianapolis, and also with board member and someone I admire greatly, a great friend, Kip Tew. We have just one other question I want to ask you about Indianapolis. Did he embrace his hometown? Did he love coming back here? Was he thrilled to be honored by his peers or people he knew as a kid, as someone who, he didn't escape poverty and then, go on to do great things, but he became worldwide famous and he was just a Shortridge High School IPS kid.
Yes, in time, in the early 1990s, David Hoppy of Nouveau and some other people were putting together a festival. I'm going to blank on the name of it, but it had the word "word" in it. So they summoned him back, and Vonnegut, for whatever reason, had a blast on that trip, and he ran into some Shortridge High School friends, and he stuck around in town for a while. And after that, he started to look much more forward to coming back to Indy. And I think Indy had gone on to embrace him a little bit more as a writer. While his books are certainly still controversial, depending on who's reading them and what their take on the world is. I don't think he was public enemy number one anymore, starting in the early 1990s. So he grew to have great affection for Indianapolis, and I think your childhood is. Every human being on the face of the earth looks at the past in rose-colored glasses to a certain degree. So, Indianapolis was partly a mythologized childhood, especially his time at Lake Maxatucky. He wrote about that as well.
Did he stay in touch with his Army buddies?
He stayed in touch with Bernie O'Hare and maybe two or three others. And, after that, I think it was just the normal separation of time, plus the fact that, you got a fair amount of veterans that don't want to rehash.
Sure. And there's no Facebook when Kurt Vonnegut died. Which
there are some famous stories about when he came back, and you can probably tell the story better than I because I miss the details. I don't tell a story every day, but he came back for a book signing at one point. I think it was for Slaughterhouse-Five, and it wasn't well attended, right?
Yeah. And that was in the early 70s at the Ellis Ayres downtown at the building that his father designed. Mm-hmm. He was upset about it, and obviously, as someone who's worked at a museum for a long time, I've been to a lot of book signings. Sometimes something as simple as weather can destroy a book signing, but I think he took it as a bit of an Indiana doesn't like my books with drawings of assholes and four-letter words in it, which it's entirely possible that Indiana didn't like it. So, and that aspect was true in his family as well. There were members of his family who read his books and thought this is terrible.
So you would know better than anyone, I think. What is the behind-the-scenes story of Kurt Vonnegut's cameo in Rodney Dangerfield's movie Back to School, where Rodney Dangerfield says, "Kurt, what's he you don't
know the first thing about
his teacher says that she was in MASH. I'm blanking on her name, and she just died.
Can't think of it.
wait a second. Our crack research department is on it right now, Mr. Chris Spangle.
Yeah, I'm tell you the truth.
How did he get on? Talk about one of the most ridiculous cameos of all time.
I think Bob Whitey was pretty involved in it. I mean, he talks about it in the documentary, how he was just kind of contacted because they were working on this film, and they thought, oh, okay, I wonder if he would do the cameo, and sure enough, he did.
So wasn't he doing a paper on Vonnegut? Wasn't
Yeah.
His
His teacher said, do a paper on Vonnegut. So he hires to write Vonnegut to write the paper on Vonnegut.
And he gets a C or
he
something.
Gets a C, and she says, you don't know the first thing about Vonnegut. Then Dangerfield calls him and yells at him or something. But I wonder if they wrote Vonnegut in and then asked him, or asked him and then said, okay, now we can write him in, because he said...
I think they asked him. I would assume they asked him first. I actually don't know.
It does bring up another thing, and I know we're kind of running out of time, but one of the things that I've found in my decade here working here is the number of stand-up comedians who and musicians who owe their inspiration to their careers to Kurt Vonnegut and come through this place and look at it as sort of like coming to nirvana for them. There's so many of them. Our board chair now is a famous stand-up comedian who also is a film star and other things, Lewis Black. But we've had so many people who have come through our doors or helped us over the years to become what we are now, who got their start because they found in Kurt Vonnegut something that they could help laugh at, and how his humor made them better stand-up comedians or inspired them.
And we should
we've
note
heard
that
that story.
He and Dangerfield would have been contemporaries, probably. I mean, they would have
Yes.
been close to the same age for sure.
Yep.
The person I'm trying to think of is Sally Kellerman.
Oh, Sally. Oh.
Before we get to the 5 questions, we ask all guests, and you don't have to answer these as Kurt Vonnegut. You can just give us your answers. Spend a few minutes, please, and talk about your library and museum located here in downtown Indianapolis.
Yeah. Being able to do this has been the honor and privilege of a lifetime. We get visitors in from all over the world who, just like Kip said, I don't want to make it sound too strange, but like there's a lot of people who walk in here and say, Kurt, help me do this, help me do that. It's a much more common thing than you would think for someone to come in and say, this guy helped me get through the death of my father, or alcoholism through, when I was in AA. I had a friend who plays on my adult kickball team, and he's like, yeah, when I was doing some time, I was reading Slaughterhouse-Five, and I thought, wow, this is so powerful that his writing has this impact on people. So on top of having a museum where we focus on free speech, we have a freedom of expression exhibit because Vonnegut's books started getting banned in the late 1960s, and that has not stopped. It's still going on. Everywhere you go, there's someone who will find a 4-letter word in a book and say, this should be out of libraries and out of schools. With the invention of the internet, that sounds even more strange than it must have sounded back in the 60s and 70s. So we give away free copies of Slaughterhouse-Five to students who want to read it. That's one of our programs. Every year during Banned Book Week, which is the last week of September, we have lots of programming going on. This year we've got the Brooklyn Book the Brooklyn Book Club. I'm going to blank on their name, but they're a band. So we've got an entire band that's going to be living in our museum this year. They're going to be working on a musical project with some musicians from Indianapolis kind of helping out with that. So we're an anti-censorship organization. We're sitting in an office right now as part of our third floor, which is our Slaughterhouse-Five exhibit. We feature a veteran's artwork at all times in this exhibit. Right now, we've got the Iraq War veteran Sean Augustin's paintings on display. He's from Columbus, Ohio. We've got a guy named Ed Carrion. His work's going to be coming in pretty soon here, so he'll be on display throughout the year. A photographer named Jack Wicks, Jack. He's going to be bringing in an exhibit at some point.
He's on our board as well.
Yeah, so we do a lot of programming with that. We go into schools. Yeah, it's just been very, very rewarding.
Well, what's your website address and your physical address if people want to visit?
We are at VonnegutLibrary.org, and our socials are at Vonnegut Library. And then we're located at 543 Indiana Avenue, which is right across the street from the Walker Theater.
and you get support from around the country, around the world, that it's not just an Indiana thing.
Without a doubt.
Yeah, all over the world.
We've reached the point in the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. You ready, Chris?
Oh, yeah.
What was your first job?
Corn detasseling. I was in 7th grade, I think. I was the laziest kid in the family by far. And when my father dragged me out of bed at 5 in the morning and he drove me so far, like Indianapolis to Tipton is a bit of a drive. So I was about 30 minutes into thinking my father was taking me out to execute me. And, which, I mean, I say this with all great love. The man has passed on and he, didn't have a lot of stomach for a kid who just wanted to listen to the Grateful Dead and take naps all day long. So, yeah, anyway, he drove me out to this farm where it was 300 degrees and the bugs were crawling up my nose. And I'll never forget that experience as long as I live. And hopefully my kids will never know I'm going to make sure they wait tables.
Joy.
Yeah.
Joy.
Yeah, I'm gonna make sure they work in the service industry so they never give someone a bad tip as long as they live. But yeah, I probably won't make them corn detassel.
Number 2, what was your first concert?
Oh, man. First concert I can remember, Elton John and Billy Joel at the RCA Dome in 96 or something like that. John Denver was around that time for him, too.
If you could recommend any, I hesitate to even ask this question. Please make it a non-Kurt Vonnegut selection. If you could recommend any book for someone to read, not written by Kurt Vonnegut, which book would you choose?
Jesus Christ.
Is that the Bible? Yeah.
Do I have to limit this to one?
We'd prefer you do the same thing that other people do, but you're a rebel.
Yeah. Well, I'll make this fair. When I was reading Cat's Cradle during that time of great economic lack of achievement, I was also reading Cannery Row by John Steinbeck. So let's go with that one. That was pretty life-altering.
If you could witness any event in history, be there as it happens, which event would you choose?
Oh, wow. I'm from the general Toronto area, and I don't know why this came into my head. No idea. Well, Charles Mingus had his centennial this year, so maybe that's why. Massey Hall in 1953, possibly, had a concert where Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Bud Powell, Charles Mingus, and Max Roach were playing as a quintet. And the show was kind of a disaster. Charlie Parker pawned his saxophone for heroin like a couple hours beforehand, and he had to go get he was playing a plastic alto saxophone, and Mingus was pissed off that his bass was too low in the mixer, so they had to overdub his bass. And for some reason, I just think that would be a really interesting, it's this legendary blown out of proportion concert that nearly all of the stars were angry about in the aftermath. And I just think that would be an interesting thing to witness.
The last question is, if you could have dinner with anyone living today, whom would you choose?
I come from a long line of people that take table manners too seriously. So you remember when you were a kid and someone really elderly would say, take your elbows off the table or something really, really weird like that. You wonder who was like, oh, elbows, those are offensive. So I'd like to find the person that invented that rule.
Well, I can tell you, it's my mother and father who were both in the Marine Corps.
My grandfather pretended not to be colorblind so that he could join the Canadian Air Force, and they were so pissed when he couldn't tell red from green. And he was like that. It would be one thing if they had a preference for not doing that, but they would lose their tempers over this. And I'd like to sit there and have dinner and just eat chicken wings or something really messy and wipe my hands on my white T-shirt and just watch that person have a coronary.
Okay.
I bet you've not had an answer anything like that.
No, those are all pretty, pretty unique. But Kip, if I can remember these, I'm going to add, you've already answered the 5 questions because you were on with Murray Clark. several months ago, which we enjoyed very much. But let me see if I can remember the 4 questions I asked Governor Eric Holcomb when I interviewed him for the Capitol Chronicle. So I know the first one. What was your first car?
First car I drove or first car I owned?
First car you owned.
It was an Opel. It had like 6 colors on it because it had been half painted. I bought it for $400 in Bloomington when I was a senior in college. When it rained, it leaked and the radio didn't work and no air conditioning.
I'm envious that you had $400 as a senior in college.
Student loans, baby.
Oh, boy.
What was your, if you could choose, let me do it this way. If you could choose any game for your team to win that they lost, any of your favorite teams, which game would you choose?
Well, the first one that comes to mind is IU versus Maryland national championship basketball game. Probably that would be the one. That's the one that comes to mind. I wish Andrew Luck would have won a Super Bowl, but I don't think we got far enough or long for that. But those are my 2 answers.
If you could witness any sporting event in history, which one would you choose? Be there in person.
Boy, that's a tough one. Probably Gale Sayers in his prime.
Scoring 6 touchdowns against the 49ers.
Yeah, I mean, but there's so many. Would have loved to seen Pele in person. I would have loved to watch Kareem Abdul-Jabbar play in his prime, Wilt Chamberlain, Bill Russell.
Sure.
I'm a bigger basketball fan than anything, so it would come down to basketball.
Watch Wilt score 100 points in Hershey, Pennsylvania. Last question for Kip Tew. If you could have dinner with anyone who's ever lived in Indiana, whom would you choose?
Lee Hamilton.
Living or dead?
Yeah, Lee Hamilton. I think he's our greatest politician, he's still living. He said living or dead, he's still alive.
Yeah.
Okay.
I could probably have it if I worked hard enough at it, but I just think he's one of the most brilliant statesmen we've ever had in state. So
We've tried to get him on the podcast without luck, but we've had a couple people reach out to him. He's a terrific public servant.
Yep.
Would you choose Kurt Vonnegut?
Yeah. I mean, there's. Oh man, it's those questions are impossible.
That's why we ask them.
There's so many interesting people in the world. There's an author that both Kip and I really love named Jess Walter.
I've actually had dinner with Jess Walter.
You want to just end on that note?
Sure.
Thank you for listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guests have been Chris Lafave, curator, the Kurt Vonnegut Museum and Library, and the wonderful, delightful, and talented, lovely
Oh, my God.
Kip Tew. Kip, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and making this happen. I reached out to you a long time ago, and I'm glad we could finally make it.
Well, I thank you for helping highlight one of the great treasures in Indianapolis, so we appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you both.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.